This is a Tamiya catalog from 1978. It is the oldest one I have. When I was a kid, I always looked forward to getting the Tamiya catalog every year, and one of the sections I liked most was the dioramas of François Verlinden, or as I called him as a kid, François Verlinden. Verlinden and Shepard Payne were probably the two premier modelers of the 70s and 80s. So I was very excited when he came out with this book, which is really nothing but a collection of photos of his dioramas. There is some text, but it's in Japanese. Several of his dioramas have always stuck in my mind, including this one of the Tamiya M3 Stuart. I have always wanted to try and copy his work, and now I am finally going to try it. I also have this book, which includes text descriptions in English of how Verlinden built his dioramas, and includes a chapter on weathering the Sherman, which is of course applicable to the Stuart as well. You would think that it would be helpful, but Verlinden mostly used Humbrol enamel paints, which you cannot get anymore. So he calls out paint colors by their Humbrol name, and even then, the description of his technique is pretty vague. Surprisingly, my local hobby store carries Humbrol acrylics, but there are no names on the paint tins, just a lid and a number. So I will be using mostly Vallejo paints. Verlinden was much more of a painter than a builder. From what I can tell, he built his kits straight from the box with little to no scratch building and no apparent effort to fix the inaccuracies so common in the kits of that era. His dioramas just showcase the model, but rarely did they tell any kind of a story. That was perfect for the Tamiya catalog though. His other trick was to use a backdrop to the diorama so the photograph looked like a real scene. So I'm going to try and build sort of a pseudo copy of his Stuart diorama. One of the biggest differences is that I am going to use the relatively recent M3 Stuart from Tamiya rather than the old M3 Stuart from the 70s, which is pretty poor. Also, according to this book, which I bought back in 1979 for $3.95, the new Tamiya Stuart is actually an M3A1, not an M3. Also, it is a fairly early M3A1 with an all-riveted hull. I am doing this because this is a painting video and not a build video, and I wanted a really easy build of a really nice kit, and that is exactly what I got. It is both easy to assemble and well detailed. I only needed putty in about 2 places. The only hard part about this kit is the decals, particularly the turret stripes. I'm not going to show the build because it's not particularly interesting. It's just your basic high quality Tamiya build. It took me about 2 days. So let's jump right into the painting. Back in the 70s, enamel paints were much better than acrylics, so Verlinden did most of his painting with enamels. But today acrylics are better and it's actually pretty hard to get good enamels. So I'm going to be using Vallejo acrylics for most of the painting. I start by airbrushing on Vallejo Olive Drab Primer. This was a little bit challenging because the color is almost exactly the same color as the plastic, so it was kind of hard to tell where I painted. Apparently, Verlinden did use light oversprays of other colors over his base coat, and so my second coat of olive drab was intended to be that. But since it was such a close match, it didn't really work out that way. But I will end up doing another overspray again later. After the base color is applied and the light overspray, the next step is a black enamel wash. I remember using black enamel washes in the 70s and having no problems with them, but this time I couldn't get it to work. The only black enamel paint I could find was Testors, and whatever kind of solvent I used, it just would not dissolve, so it really didn't work. I'm just willing to bet that EPA regulations have something to do with that. So then I tried using black acrylic paint dissolved in Vallejo airbrush thinner, and that didn't really work either. It left some water spots. So finally I went back to my tried and true Vallejo dark gray wash. I don't know what it is that they use to thin this stuff, but it goes on perfectly, it spreads well, and it never seems to leave spots. So I applied this dark gray wash over the entire model. Then I went back and did a light overspray of the original olive drab color. I'm not sure whether that's a technique that Verlinden actually used, but I've used it a lot in the past, so I was pretty comfortable with it. So at this point we've done the black wash and then the light overspray of olive drab again. and now it's time for the dry brushing. So we're going to mix the U.S. olive drab and we're going to lighten it with U.S. Army tank crew. And this is the main dry brushing for the model. The general rule in dry brushing is that as you go lighter in shade, you use less and less paint and you're hitting more raised details. So even though I'm only using 2 colors, the proportion in which I mix them is going to affect the shade, so I can get really an infinite number of shades with these colors. And I want to make sure that I get the center of the panels. That's what gives some depth to the model. Dry brushing is pretty hard on your brushes, and you want to use pretty high quality brushes. So clean them with isopropyl alcohol or this Lysol all-purpose cleaner, both of which are pretty cheap and easy to find as long as there's not a worldwide pandemic going on. On his armor models, Verlinden liked to use a dry brush of a steel color along with the base paint color, so I'm doing that here. This gives it a metallic sheen. He typically did this at least to the gun barrel and any other places on the model that would get some wear. I'm applying it to the trailing idler wheel. I'm also going to dry brush just the metal on the machine gun barrels. Yes, I'm using too big of a brush for this, but I was too lazy to switch brushes. Here I'm dry brushing the rubber on the road wheels. Basically, there's no part of the model that doesn't get a dry brush treatment. His dry brushing really almost goes to white when you look at it. And so I feel like I need another lightening of dry brush. So I'm using the base olive drab and I'm mixing it with silver gray. And I'm just going over really lightly, just kind of hitting the rivets and any other raised areas. Note how light the highlights are on the rivets, the exhaust, and on the box on the tank's rear deck. One thing worth noting, he decided to paint the Pioneer tools wood and metal colors rather than olive drab. I chose to go with olive drab. I think in the U.S. Army there was basically nothing on a vehicle that wasn't painted olive drab. Once the dry brushing is done, it's time to apply the decals, and the decals on this kit I think are pretty challenging. I don't think I'm all that good at decals anyway, but the yellow stripes are the worst part. So I just put on the numbers and some of the stars. I used the Microset and Microsol pair of solutions. One goes on before the decal and one after, and I never remember which is which. Always have to look at it. And then after the decals are on, I spray everything with Tester's Dull Coat. I do like the fact that this kit has blue numbers and yellow stars. It's a nice change up from the typical U.S. military World War II armored vehicles. The figures came from the U.S. Gun and Mortar team, which obviously has been around since the 70s. I'm not going to show painting the figures because it's just really too hard to film. I have done some figures recently, so I'm not entirely out of practice, but they were larger scale and they weren't U.S. military, so I'm going to have to figure out my colors again. I don't know whether it was because the molds were so old, but these figures had a lot of flash on them, so there was a lot of filing to clean them up. The diorama base starts as a plaque that I got at an art supply store. I give the plaque a coat of stain and a couple of coats of polyurethane. The polyurethane protects the plaque from warping as you apply the ground cover. My groundwork starts out with AK Interactive dry ground texture. Of course, Verlinden didn't have AK Interactive products to work with. His groundwork was typically some kind of plaster or siliclay covered with fine gravel or sand, and sometimes he used kitty litter. I'm going to be adding some sand and fine gravel later, but this was a really convenient way to get started. It was easier than mixing up a batch of Sculptamold, which is what I normally use for ground cover. I don't think his diorama had a really well-defined road, but it seemed to make sense here. So I'm going to mark out the position of the elements of this diorama. And then for the road, I'm going to use this Vallejo sand texture, which is a little bit of a finer grain than the ground texture that I already used. But it's really not going to be noticeable, so I'm going to come back and I'm going to have to do some refinements on the texture for the road. His Volume 2 book describes how to make sandbags using epoxy putty, so that's what I'm doing here. I have an old Tamiya sandbag that I'm using for a size comparison. This was actually my first time ever making sandbags out of putty like this, and honestly, it didn't quite go as well as I would have hoped. I just don't think they looked that good. But by the time I realized I wasn't that happy with them, they were already well integrated into the base. And although this isn't intended to be an exact copy of his diorama, I wanted to keep it kind of close. I was doing this for memory, and then I realized looking at his photos that I didn't really come close to matching the way he built his sandbag wall. Here I get my fingers wet and I use them to smooth out the contours of the sandbag. Then, in order to add some cloth texture to the sandbags, I'm just using a Kleenex, but it didn't really leave a good impression. I think it's best to do this with some kind of cloth material, but I didn't have a suitable sample available to use. Off camera, I added some sand and some fine gravel. Some of the sand came from a Woodland Scenics sand and gravel road kit. Some of the sand and gravel came just from stream beds and places I found it outside. I sealed it in with white glue diluted with water, and sometimes I used some Woodland Scenics scenic cement. Now I'm painting it with washes of various tan colors. These are just cheap craft store acrylic paints. Well, I couldn't pass up the chance to play around with yet another texture, so this is AK Interactive Desert Sand texture, and it looks pretty much like the dry ground texture. It's a little bit finer maybe. But since I didn't really like the color, I'm going to overpaint everything anyway. I'm going to go back and add the washes like I did before, and then I'm going to do a light overspray of tan with an airbrush. Around the edges, I'm going to do a light overspray of black with an airbrush. If you look at his diorama, it looks like he sprayed some black around the edges. I don't know if he's trying to imitate the type of vignetting that you see in photography, but it seems to have that effect. A couple of other details worth noticing in this picture is the cloth tarpaulin hanging off the side and the empty shell casings on the deck of the tank. The tarpaulin is easy to do. I cut out a square of Kleenex, I wetted it down and hung it over the side of the tank. Then I covered it with diluted white glue and let it dry. Now I paint the tarpaulin, being careful not to get any paint on the body of the vehicle. It will also get the black wash and then dry brushing. This is a really good way to hide mistakes on your vehicle. Now it's time to add the spent cartridge casings. I'm not sure how he did it, but I'm going to guess that he did it with stretched sprue and then painted them brass and cut them to length. So that's what I'm going to try. It was a little bit tricky. It took me about 7 or 8 attempts to get a piece of sprue that wasn't too thin and didn't break apart. This one looks like it's a good diameter. Typically what you want to do is hold the sprue about 1 to 2 inches above the flame, and wait until the sprue just naturally bends and then pull it. But if you pull too fast, it will break. This is typically how you make antennas. But once you've broken it, you really can't weld it back together. You have to start with a new sprue. I painted the sprue brass, and here I'm trying to cut off the individual cartridge cases. But the cases are shooting all over the place as I cut them off the sprue. I placed a tweezer on the paper to try and block them, but it just wasn't really working. Yeah, in this shot everything looks fine, but for the most part sprue pieces were shooting everywhere. So I figured out that the trick is to put the sprue on masking tape and then cut it in place on the masking tape. The masking tape will hold the pieces in place. I very carefully dip the sprue pieces in some super glue gel and glue them to the tank. You have to be very careful not to get glue spots on the tank. I'm going to spray it with dull coat anyway, but you also want to be careful not to scratch the paint on the tank with the tweezers. That 4 to 6 inches of sprue gave me enough so I could add some spent cartridge cases by the machine gun nest and the sandbags. It's a little bit easier on the groundwork because you don't have to worry so much about glue spots. They don't show up as much as on the back of the tank. Every once in a while you have to clean the glue off the tip of your tweezer. I just do that with a razor blade. In his diorama, he had a gnarled old tree by the front of the sandbags. I haven't had much time to look around for tree branches to use in dioramas, but I did find this one outside my front door in one of the bushes in my landscaping. So I drilled out a hole in the bottom and I stuck in a brass wire and I drilled a hole in the base and I'm gluing it in using the brass wire as a support. I also added the log near the signpost. Originally, I wasn't going to try and mess with the turret stripe decals, but then after I saw that Andy's Hobby Headquarters put them on, I decided to give it a try. If you're going to put on the turret stripe, don't put on the machine gun mount until after you've applied the decals. I had to pry the machine gun mount off of the turret, and fortunately I was successful doing that. The turret stripe runs from the edge of each machine gun port on the side. So it runs from one machine gun port edge to the other machine gun port edge. It doesn't overlap the ports, which is what is shown in the instructions. It does pass over the rear port, and it just is really difficult to get a decal to sit correctly over that kind of a contour. Also, the decal on the mantlet has to wrap around that contour. So overall, it's just a really challenging set of decals to get to look good. In the end, I wish I hadn't bothered with the stripes. I think the tank looks better without them. Here we can take one last look at his diorama. I hadn't really noticed before I started working on this, but his is really cluttered. Everything is very close together, and the tank looks like it's about to run over the machine gun team. Mine is much farther apart. One reason for that is because I used a store-bought base. I didn't really have a lot of sizes to choose from, so this is what I went with. And then I also didn't add all the signpost stuff that he put in. Plus, it just seemed weird to have the tank that close to the machine gun team. I'm generally pretty happy with the way it turned out, but there are a couple things that bug me. For example, they're in the desert and there's absolutely no dust on the tank. He didn't put any dust on his tank either. Also, it could have used a few more figures. Back then, there weren't that many figures for him to choose from, so I understand why he only used 2. And he was really just making a display piece, so it wasn't that big of a deal. But now, with so many figures to choose from, the diorama could use a few more. I'd been away from armor modeling for a long time, and even though I'd done a lot of it in the past, I still learned a lot doing this. Trying to copy someone else's work forces you to try things you wouldn't try otherwise, so I kind of recommend it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and for you older guys, I hope you enjoyed the little nostalgic tour back into the 70s and the world of Verlinden.